Hello, and welcome to Burns Banter, the podcast that takes a fresh look at the life and works of Robert Burns, hosted by myself, Alistair Turnbull. Now, in this episode, we're going to look at the last few years of Robert's life, and I'm going to look at three different aspects. Firstly, I'm going to look at his personal life, what was going on there. Then I'm going to look at the poems he has been writing. What poems did he write in the last few years of his life? And then finally, I'm going to look at his death. What caused the death of Robert Burns? When did he die? Where did he die? And then we're going to finish off with a poem. So let's dive straight in and look at his personal life just now. Okay, so what was happening in Robert's personal life? Well, the year is 1793, and he was living with his family, Jean and the kids, in a place called Bank Street, just a three-room apartment. It was too cramped, so he decided to move. So the whole family moved in May 1793 to a place called Mill Vennel. And they moved into a house that had an upstairs and a downstairs. It was 2 bedrooms, a parlour, a kitchen, and a small study for Robert to write in. It's even said there was a small garden for Jean to grow things for the house as well, some food. So they moved to a better place. And they had a reason for moving because their family was getting bigger. Because in 1794, I think it was, 1794, yep, he had a son. Jean gave birth again, and they gave birth to James Glencairn Burns. Now, I'll just briefly tell you a bit about James Glencairn Burns because he was one of the few children of Burns to actually make it into adulthood. And he did quite well for himself. He originally went away when he was quite young to the East India Company as a cadet. And in India, he joined the Bengal Native Infantry and became a major. He married over there. He had a family. Unfortunately, his wife died. He moved back home to Scotland. He married again, eventually moved back out again, became a lieutenant colonel. Unfortunately, again, his wife died, and he came back to Britain. He came back to Britain an influential and wealthy man, but the last years of his life, he lived in Cheltenham, and he actually shared a house with his brother, William Nicol Burns, down there. Anyway, that's James Glencairn Burns, born in 1794. What else is happening in Robert's personal life? Well, he is still working as an excise officer. The reason he moved to Dumfries in the first place was because he got promoted to the footwalk, which meant you didn't need to have a horse. And at the end of 1794, beginning of 1795, he got a small promotion, a temporary promotion, to acting supervisor, because the acting supervisor, a guy called Findlater, was actually ill. Now, Robert took over the job. He found it quite difficult for a little while, quite a lot to do, but he was very glad of the extra money because the new house they had with higher rents, they had a bigger family, he had more calls on his money, and he was finding it quite difficult. And he got an extra £12 in his salary for doing the supervisor's job, which he was very grateful for. Also, at the time, Britain was at war with France. This is the French Revolution time and all the rest of it. And Britain was convinced that France was going to invade. And they didn't have much of an army, so they encouraged people to create sort of volunteer army brigades. And the Dumfries Volunteers sprung up in response to that. And Robert was one of the first people to join the Dumfries Volunteers, an army unit basically to protect the country, you know. Now, he didn't do it because he wanted to fight the French. He did it because he wanted to have some sort of respectability about him. He'd been getting into trouble a lot as a sort of rebel, you know, kind of a character not very respectable. And he wanted to show his respectability, his reliability. So he was one of the first to join the Dumfries Volunteers. And as he actually got involved in running them as well. And part of that was getting a uniform. And he went to a tailor, a guy called, give me 1 second. He actually went to a tailor to get a uniform, and the tailor was called David Williamson. His uniform actually cost £8.07, which is a fortune back then, especially when you've not got much money in your back pocket. So his personal life is doing okay so far. He's getting more of a family. He's joined the volunteers. He's doing okay with work. He's trying to get a bit more respectability, but he's starting to get ill at this point in his life. And they had a real disaster in the family. His daughter died in 1795. Elizabeth Riddle Burns. She was only 3 years of age, and she died. And Robert was devastated. So was Jean. And Robert was doubly devastated because he was so ill, he couldn't attend the funeral. He could not attend his own daughter's funeral because of his own illness. That gives us the first sign of how ill Robert is becoming. Anyway, there's not enough a lot more in his personal life, so let's move on to what poems is he writing at the time. Right. It's towards the end of Robert's life. What poems is he writing? Well, I'll tell you, he wrote a few crackers before he passed away in the last couple of years of his life. One of them being, My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose. Now, this is quite controversial, this one. He actually said that it was an old Scottish song that he found, and he gave it in a letter to a guy called George Thompson. But I don't believe it was an old Scotch song that he found. I think he wrote it. He had to have written it because the language in it is talking about geological time, you know, when the seas gang dry and the rocks melt with the sun. And that's all deep time. It's brand new concepts, mainly from a guy called James Hutton. Now, James Hutton was Robert knew him. I don't know if he was a good friend, but he knew him. And James Hutton was known as the father of modern geology. And he talks about deep time. And I think Robert's written this song, but because he was getting into, you know, hot water about his views about France, and he was quoting controversy and all the rest of it, I don't think he wanted to create any more controversy whatsoever. And I think he just lied about this. I think he said he just found it and passed this off as someone else's work when I think it was his. Now, I actually do an entire episode about this poem, My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose. So if you want to hear the entire story, look back to Series 1 of Burns Banter. Series 1, Episode 18 is all about My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose. You'll find out the whole story there. Let's move on. That's not the only one that he wrote back then. 1793, he also wrote a song called Scots Wha Hae, which is Scots Wha Hae with Wallace bled, you know. Welcome to your gory bed. It goes on to death and victory and all the rest of it. And he actually wrote this. He imagined himself being Robert the Bruce. And he was talking about what would Robert the Bruce have said to his soldiers on his march to Bannockburn. So this Scots Wha Hae is all about Robert Bruce jeering up the troops to fight at Bannockburn, you know. A great song. Please look into it, listen to it, you know, read it. It's well worth it. One more that he wrote, and actually he wrote this in, I think it was 1795. A Man's a Man for All That. One of Robert's best ever songs, I think. One of his most recited songs. A Man's a Man. A song of equality, of hating, of contempt of rank. That basically, you know, man's a man, brothers be for all that. It's all about being equal. It's a great poem, a great leveler. It's just, and he wrote it in 1795, just a year before he died. So, I mean, Robert's ill just now. He thinks he's facing the end of his life. Maybe he's getting more inspiration to write better poetry. I mean, it's harsh, but maybe true. Again, look up a man's a man for all that. Even Dougie MacLean does a great version of the song. So look up the Dougie MacLean version of the song. One other thing he wrote, which is not really of note, but I'll bring it in anyway. He had a toothache towards the end of his life that was really just giving him a real jip. And he wrote a poem all about the toothache. Again, there's an episode about it all together in Burns Banter. It's Series 1, Episode 20, The Ode to the Toothache. It's quite funny. Go back and listen to it. It'd be great. So Robert is still writing a lot of poetry towards the end of his life. I mean, even just weeks and days before he died, he was sending off songs and poems to George Thompson, to James Johnson. These are the people he was working with books called Select Scottish Airs and the Scottish Musical Museum. He worked right up pretty much till the day he died. He was writing and contributing and giving more to the world. there's not much more I can say about that. He worked all the time, he gave all the time, and in the last few years of his life, he wrote some great poetry. Okay, Robert Burns' death. Now, Robert had been growing more and more unwell through the years 1794, 1795, and then intensely in the beginning of 1796. It was like a rheumatic fever he had. He was sore all over. He had no energy. He was pale. He was losing weight. He had no appetite. Now, we can now say with the modern medicine behind us, after looking at his symptoms, that he died of bacterial endocarditis, which was secondary to chronic rheumatic heart disease. Now, that's a disease that affects the membrane of the surrounding of the heart and was probably the result of having suffered from rheumatic fever as a child. Robert had a lot of illness when he was a child. He had a lot of malnutrition as well. It set him up for a life of illness and hardship, unfortunately. But that's not what a lot of his biographers said. A lot of his biographers said he died because he was an alcoholic and a womanizer. This is not true. And I'm going to talk about the last few weeks of his life just now. He was actually attended by a physician who was a friend of his, a guy called William Maxwell. And William Maxwell thought he had sort of flying gout or something, you know. And the way to cure that was to go sea bathing. So he told Robert, who was emaciated, he was white, to go to, he had no energy. He told him to go to a place called the Brow. Now, the Brow was about 10 miles south of Dumfries on the Solway coast. And he told him to go there because he wanted him to do two things. There was a well there called the Brow Well, and it's water that's rich in iron and all the rest of it. And it was said to have healing powers. So he wanted him to go and drink the waters. But he also wanted him to bathe in the Solway Firth. He said he must go into the Solway Firth up to his armpits daily. Now, if there's one thing you want to do, or the one thing you don't want to do when you've got a heart condition, is go into freezing cold water. And basically, his doctor told him to do that. His doctor probably brought about his death quicker than it would have happened. Let's look at the Brow Well itself. Now, the Brow Well is quite a lonely place. I was lucky enough that last week, me and my wife went down to the Solway Firth. So I'd never seen the Brow Well before. And I knew I was doing this episode and I wanted to go and have a look at it. So we went down there, and it's actually described as quite a desolate small hamlet. It's not even that anymore. There's one house beside the Brow Well and a view out to the Solway Firth, which is just all mud and sand. Not a great view. There's another old derelict house on the other side of it. And it's not even a proper well as you would think of a well today. It's not a circular stone well, with a bucket getting lowered down to it and anything like that. The Brow Well is just, it's dug out of the ground. It's now a square hole in the ground with stone all the way around about it. And the water runs through the ground. And you put a cup in and you take the water up and drink it. By the way, it tastes, well, I've heard it tastes foul. There's no way I would drink the water out of that well now. But Robert went there. He did what the doctor said. He went to the Brow Well. He took the last of his strength. He drank the waters. He did the sea bathing. And it really didn't do him much good at all. When he was there, he met up with Maria Riddle, who was the wife of Captain Riddle, who died a wee while earlier on. He was friends with them. And they met up at a manse somewhere, and she was shocked at his weakened state. And he always one for being dramatic. Robert greeted her with this message. He said, "Well, ma'am, do you have any commands for the other side?" In other words, I'm going to die. Now, he went there for about 2 weeks, on and off, to the Brow Well, again, 10 miles south of Dumfries. I know he went back and forward because I know for a fact on the 14th of July, he was back in Dumfries picking up his wages from the excise. And it was the last time he was in the excise office. And it was the 14th of July. And he basically was saying goodbye to them because he knew he was going to die. Back to the Brow Well, tried the waters again, didn't work. About the 17th or 18th of July, his strength was gone. He had nothing left. and he couldn't make it back to Dumfries. He couldn't walk back. He didn't have the strength. He couldn't even ride a horse to get back to Dumfries. So he called on a friend of his, a guy called John Craig, from Lockerwoods was the place he lived, and he asked John Craig to lend him his gig, which is a carriage and horse, to take him back to Dumfries. John obviously said yes, gave him the carriage. Off he went back to Dumfries, and he went up the stairs to his own bed. And even when he was in bed, he was still writing poetry and writing songs and sending them out. But he only lasted 4 days. He was attended by Dr. William Maxwell, who tried to look after him even better. It's actually said that, well, I know for a fact that, I think it was the last night before Robert died, Maxwell was there, and he said to him, "There's my pistols," because Robert needed pistols when he was an excise man. He said, "William, you take the pistols. I can't imagine them being in any better care. You have them." So he took them. And on the very last night of his life, in his house, there was a guy called John Gibson, who was also one of the Dumfries volunteers, a friend of his in the Dumfries volunteers. And one of the last things that Robert said, no, probably not the last thing he said, but one of the last things he said to John was, he said, "John, don't let the awkward squad fire over me," which is basically, don't let the Dumfries volunteers fire volleys over my coffin. They weren't very good at shooting, and he just didn't want it to happen. Unfortunately, at 5 in the morning on the 21st of July, 1796, Robert died. He left his widow, Jean, 31, I think she was at the time, his family, debts, and not a great situation for them. It was difficult for them after he died, and his friends knew it. A lot of his friends rallied together and tried to give them money to help them on their way because they knew the situation they were in. And people got together to try and honour Burns. Other people got together to write nasty things about him. But that was the end of his life, 21st of July, 1796. 4 days later, Robert was buried. And he was buried at the St. Michael's Cemetery in Dumfries. After being paraded through the town, his coffin was paraded through the town. The Dumfries volunteers were there. He was buried with full military honours, actually. And despite his request, "Don't let the opera squad fire over me," when he was being buried, when the earth was being shoveled on his coffin, they fired 3 volleys over his coffin. Lots of people were there. There was thousands of people there at the funeral, very well attended. Unfortunately for Robert, there was only one close member of his family. His brother Gilbert was there, but no other close members of his family were there at all. They couldn't make it, including his wife, Jean. His wife couldn't make it to the funeral because she was giving birth to their last son that they named Maxwell Burns. Well, she named him Maxwell Burns after William Maxwell, the doctor. She didn't know that a couple of weeks earlier, when Robert was at the Brow Well, he'd written to a friend of his called Alexander Cunningham, who was a lawyer in Edinburgh. And Alexander Cunningham was one of the few people that Burns sent his work to be criticised. Say, "Please tell me what you think." And he said to Alexander Cunningham, he said, "If the baby is of the right gender, i.e. a boy, I'm going to name him Alexander Cunningham Burns." But Jean didn't know this and named the baby Maxwell Burns. As I said, after he died, people got together and wrote either good things about him or bad things about him. And it was decided that a biography should be written. And to that end, all of Robert's papers and poems and letters were given to a guy called James Curry, who was a doctor. And he said he would write a biography of Burns, and the proceeds from the book would go to Jean and the family, Now, it took James 3 years to write that book. But I'm not surprised. He was a full-time doctor. He was writing other medical journals. But he was like one of the first biographers. And he wrote a lot of good things, but he wrote a lot of bad things, a lot of falsehoods as well. So he was one of the guys that suggested that Robert may have died of alcoholism and stuff like that, but it's not true. Other people since then have just grabbed upon that thought and they run with it, Since his death, Robert has been written about in very many different ways. He's a saint. He's a sinner. He's a drinker. He's a farmer. He's an excise man. He was a good man. He was a bad man. He was a national hero. You just have to take your pick. I believe that Robert Burns was a great poet, a great songwriter, and we are very much in his debt for a lot of the culture that we have today, a lot of the songs we have today, a lot of the poems we have today are there because he either wrote them or he collected them. No matter what you think about him as a man, his body of work stands true. I'd like to finish this episode and this series actually with this poem. This is the last episode in the series. Don't worry, I'm going to start a new series quite soon. It'll be different. I'm going to talk to people about their experience of Burns, and we're going to sing songs and recite poems, and it'll be much more interactive. But for now, I'm going to finish this series all about the life of Robert Burns with one of his best poems. And the poem is called A Man's a Man for All That. Is there for honest poverty that hings his heed and all that? The coward slave we pass him by, we dare be poor for all that. For all that and all that, our toil's obscure and all that. The rank is but the guinea stamp, the man's the gid for all that. What though on hamely fare we dine, we're hodden grey and all that? Gie fools their silks and knaves their wine, a man's a man for all that. For all that and all that, their tinsel show and all that. The honest man, though ersy poor, is king o' men for all that. Ye see yon birkie called a lord, what struts and stares and all that. Though hundreds worship at his word, he's but a coof for all that. For all that and all that, his ribbon star and all that, the man o' independent mind, he looks and laughs at all that. A prince can make a belted knight, a marquis duke and all that, but an honest man's aboon his might, gid faith he maunna fa' that. For all that and all that, their dignities and all that, the pith o' sense and pride o' worth, are higher rank than all that. Then let us pray that come it may, and come it will for all that sense and worth o'er all the earth shall bear the gree and all that. For all that and all that, it's coming yet for all that man to man the world over shall brothers be for all that. Great words by, I think, a great man. So, until we meet again on Series 3, when I'll be singing songs and telling stories and interviewing people about Burns. Until then, Slán